How many of you remember where you met your spouse? Do you remember the day, the place, what time of day? Israel thought of their relationship to God like bride to a bridegroom. We're back to the Gospel of John for these 3 Sundays in Lent. And in John's Gospel, there are 7 signs. 7, of course, is a whole number. Creation was completed on the 7th day. The very first of the 7 signs, you might remember, was the wedding feast at Cana, when Jesus turned the water into wine. If you remember that story, there were 6 stone water jars used for purification. 6 water jars. Only one more is needed to complete the number 7. Although we don't see the bridegroom, John is suggesting that the one who provides the good wine is the real bridegroom. Abundant water is first mentioned in connection with John the Baptist, who is baptizing with water. Just a few verses before today's gospel, John says very clearly that he is not the Messiah, but the one sent ahead of him. And then he says of Jesus, he who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. For this reason my joy has been fulfilled. He must increase, but I must decrease. The great patriarch Jacob met his wife Rachel at a well. You wouldn't believe what time of day it was. Right in the middle of the day, the hour was about noon. A Jewish man meets a woman at a well. Obviously, they're going to get married. So Jesus, the bridegroom, is looking for a bride, and the best place to find a bride is at a well. They didn't have movie theaters or shopping centers or bars, but everyone has to come to the well to drink. But why this woman? Why a Samaritan? The verse just before today's gospel begins, we are told Jesus left Judea and started back to Galilee, but he had to go through Samaria. Jesus literally crosses a geographical border when he goes from Judea to Samaria on his way to Galilee. He crosses ethnic, political, religious borders by being a Jew interacting with a Samaritan. In the text, if you remember, John tells us that Jews and Samaritans don't share things in common. That's the understatement of the century. They are bitter enemies. Samaria was part of the northern kingdom that was invaded by the Assyrians a couple of centuries before the southern kingdom in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians. The Assyrians brought in immigrants to intermarry with the Samaritans. The immigrants came with their own religions, their own gods, probably 5 different idols. In the eyes of the Jews, the Samaritans' worship of these 5 idols meant their worship of Yahweh was not authentic. The woman, according to Jesus, has had 5 husbands, and the one she has now is not her husband. So, altogether, she has had 6 husbands. When the Messiah comes, he will gather together what has been scattered. In John 12, verse 32, Jesus says, "And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." So Jesus had to go through Samaria because there were people there who had been cut off, scattered, and abandoned. There is no one outside of God's love, no one who is excluded. God in Jesus comes to seek out and save the lost, to gather together what has been scattered, and restore the covenant in becoming the bridegroom. The woman has had 6 husbands, the incomplete number, so Jesus becomes the 7th, the true bridegroom. At Cana, there were 6 stone water jars, But the woman leaves her water jar and goes to tell the Samaritans about a man who told her everything she'd ever done. This completes the 7 water jars. At the end of John's Gospel, we find Jesus thirsting again at the hour of the cross. And interestingly enough, in John 19, we note the hour was about noon. And after this, when Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, "I am thirsty." A jar full of sour wine was standing there, so they put a sponge full of wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." And then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Jesus drinks poor tasting wine, not like the good wine of Cana, but creation is finished. The work of the one who sent him is completed. And when Jesus pours out his spirit, water and blood flow from his side. It's a birthing image. On the cross, Jesus gives living water flowing from his side. On our pilgrimages to Israel, we begin our trip at the airport singing Psalm 42. Like a deer that longs for running streams, my soul thirsts for you, my God. Inside all of us is a great longing and emptiness, a hole that only God can fill. This holy longing is part of our humanity, a dimension of our spiritual life. In the desert, it was the lack of water that started the Israelites grumbling against Moses. But in the end, we're left with this question: is the Lord in our midst or not? Our deepest longing, our greatest thirst, is for God. Nadia Bowles-Weber reminds us that water finds its lowest point, and living water, she said, finds your lowest point. I think this is what happened to the woman at the well. I think living water found a crack in her defenses and trickled down to her lowest point, her deepest wound, her greatest need. And she finally exhaled. In fact, she relaxed so much, she totally left her water jar at the well. Nadia continues, I've always seen her water jar as a metaphor for what we think will quench our thirst, but never does. Things I think will make me whole, hide my wound, make me lovable. Because being known and loved and forgiven in our true form by our true God can quench our spiritual thirst in a way that no amount of success or admiration or romantic love or social justice work ever can. This is how seen you are by God, that whatever that lowest point of you is, whatever the deepest wound, the greatest sin, the damaged thing in you, is the living water of Christ's compassion will find it. You can just leave your water jars behind.